The pursuit to increase piston engine power and efficiency is as old as the engines themselves. To achieve these gains, designers often explore unconventional designs. One recent example of this is the Gemini Opposed piston engine. But the opposed piston engine is not a new idea. It's more than 100 years old. In this video, I'll take you over the opposed piston design, starting where it all began in the 1920s with the Junkers Jumo 204, and then we'll bring it back to the modern Gemini engine. During the 1920s, Germany's transport ministry wanted a more fuel-efficient engine for long-range operations. Dr. Hugo Junkers, who was already an expert in diesel engine design, set out to create a new opposed piston diesel Aero engine. The result was the 28.5-litre Jumo 204, which entered service in 1932. However, it was too large and heavy for widespread use. The engine's displacement was reduced to 16.6 litres in the much improved Jumo 205, with almost no reduction in power thanks to increased max RPM and numerous other improvements. The Jumo 205E had a dry weight of about 570 kilograms and produced 690 horsepower at 2500 RPM. It was one of the few successful diesel Aero engines at the time and was used on early versions of the Junkers Ju-86 airliner and bomber. However, the Jumo 205 was unresponsive to throttle changes and prone to failure at full power, making the engine ill-suited to primary combat roles. But the engine was much more successful in secondary and non-military roles, where it powered several Bloemenfos and Dornier flying boats. Although the Jumo 205 was further improved, most versions didn't progress past the prototype stage. The most notable upgrade was the high-altitude version, the Jumo 207. This version, used in the Junkers Ju-86P and R, produced up to 1000 horsepower with two-stage supercharging, one stage mechanically driven and the other by exhaust gases, enabling the engine to maintain power at high altitudes. More than 900 Jumo 205 engines were built, and while not as widely used as some other designs like the DB600 series V12s, it did play a worthy role in World War II. After the war, the Junkers engineers were captured by the Soviets, who then attempted to improve on the design, though without much success. The opposed piston design did see some use in non-aviation applications and did lead to multi-bank opposed piston designs like the Napier Deltic. But in the aviation application, the opposed piston engine faded into history. That is, until about 70 years later when it made a comeback. But before we get to that, let's take a look at the Jumo opposed piston design. The Jumo 205 was a 6-cylinder opposed piston engine, but that description is somewhat misleading as it actually had 12 pistons. And the engine was not opposed as in cylinders being located horizontally on the opposite sides of the crankshaft. No, instead it had two crankshafts with vertically opposed pistons sharing cylinders between the two crankshafts, and the propeller was driven via a complex gearing system. The Jumo 205 engine was also a diesel or compression ignition engine running a two-stroke cycle. Now, you might wonder, why use a two-stroke cycle if the goal was efficiency? After all, two-stroke engines are generally known for being less efficient than four-stroke engines. To answer that question, let's take a closer look, starting with how the engine breathes. With the crankshafts on the outside and the cylinders on the inside, a traditional cylinder head wasn't practical, nor was it desired. The engine didn't use valves. Instead, the pistons themselves uncovered and covered the intake and exhaust ports as they moved up and down. The intake ports were opened by the lower pistons, and the exhaust ports were opened by the upper pistons as they moved toward bottom dead center. This intake and exhaust design is usually referred to as uniflow scavenging. Since the pistons close and open the ports, it would not be possible to run a four-stroke cycle. Now, a two-stroke cycle comes with some inherent inefficiencies such as less efficient scavenging and poor volumetric efficiency due to intake and exhaust ports being open at the same time. But there are advantages too. In a two-stroke engine, there's a combustion event every time the pistons reach top dead center. This means the engine produces power more frequently than a four-stroke engine. Junkers addressed the inherent scavenging inefficiencies by trailing the lower crankshaft by 11 degrees behind the upper crankshaft. After combustion, the exhaust ports opened first, followed by the intake ports 11 degrees later. This allowed the exhaust gases to exit before the intake ports opened, improving scavenging and helping mitigate some of the typical two-stroke design limitations. When the intake ports opened, the already fast exiting exhaust gases reduced pressure inside the combustion chamber, which drew in fresh air. The exhaust ports then closed before the intake ports, ensuring that less fresh air was lost through the exhaust. This design likely still suffered from poor scavenging at higher engine speeds, though the Jumo 205's centrifugal supercharger helped mitigate this issue to some extent. In addition to its primary scavenging role, the supercharger provided mild boost of around 5 psi. The high-altitude Jumo 207 variant, on the other hand, included a second stage of forced induction in a turbocharger, and the Jumo 207-powered Ju86P prototype reached an impressive altitude of 10,000 meters or nearly 33,000 feet in 1940. Now, let's talk about the fact that the Jumo 205 was a diesel or compression ignition engine. This required direct fuel injection. Combustion was initiated by injecting diesel into highly compressed and heated air rather than relying on a spark. Diesel engines don't suffer from detonation issues like gasoline engines because they don't draw in a mixture of fuel and air, but only air. Fuel is then injected precisely when combustion is intended, allowing for much higher compression ratios. Compression ratio has a direct link to engine efficiency, and the Jumo 205 had a compression ratio of 17:1, at a time when production gasoline or petrol engines maxed out at around 7:1. The simplicity of the engine design, with no valve train or ignition system, made the two-stroke compression ignition setup lighter and very efficient. However, a lot of weight and complexity was reintroduced by having two crankshafts driving a single propeller via a complex gearing system. However, almost all engines of the era did have reduction drives anyway, although they would likely be a bit lighter. The Jumo 205 had a reduction ratio of 1.58:1. To put things in perspective, let's compare the Jumo 205 with some other liquid-cooled engines of the time. The Rolls-Royce Kestrel V12, which produced similar power at 685 horsepower, weighed just 434 kilograms, much lighter than the 570 kilograms of the Jumo 205. The V12 Jumo 210, another German engine by Junkers, also produced 690 horsepower, but weighed only 442 kilograms. Clearly, the Jumo 205 didn't match its petrol engine competition in terms of power-to-weight ratio. But what about specific power, which is horsepower per cubic inch of displacement? The Jumo 205 produced 0.68 horsepower per cubic inch, outperforming the Kestrel at 0.53 and the Jumo 210 at 0.57 horsepower per cubic inch. In terms of specific fuel consumption, the Jumo 205 used 0.38 pounds of fuel per horsepower hour at max continuous power, while the Kestrel consumed around 0.5 pounds and the Jumo 210 burned 0.53 pounds per horsepower hour. Despite the Jumo 205 being heavier, its better fuel efficiency meant that it would need less fuel for any given flight, offsetting the weight disadvantage. And this accounts for the fact that diesel fuel is slightly heavier than petrol. The engine's narrow frontal area also allowed for a highly streamlined nacelle, reducing drag and further enhancing this efficiency. What about balance? With the pistons directly opposed, you might assume the engine was perfectly balanced. Yes, and also no. The Jumo 205 was essentially two inline-6 engines joined at the head. Inline-6 engines are naturally balanced when using a 120-degree crank pin offset, provided their piston movement is mirrored along the center line of the two inline-3s. After analyzing multiple cross-section images, it remains unclear whether the Jumo 205 used a 120-degree offset on the crankshaft, but what is clear is that each inline-6 was not two mirrored inline-3s. As a result, each inline-6 likely experienced a rocking couple imbalance. The opposing inline-6 would fully cancel this out were it not for the 11-degree lag of the lower crankshaft. The opposed pistons not perfectly in sync prevented perfect balance. However, this imbalance was likely very small and way within acceptable limits. But the 11-degree lag of the lower crankshaft influenced the engine smoothness in another way. Each pair of opposed pistons shares a combustion event. But because the lower piston lagged 11 degrees behind the top piston, it wasn't the same number of degrees from top dead center as the upper piston when combustion occurred. So technically, the lower pistons had greater injection advance than the upper pistons. This put extra strain on the lower pistons, connecting rods and crankshaft. While diesel engines are generally more tolerant of such timing differences than gasoline engines, the imbalance likely contributed to both vibration and mechanical stress. This could explain why the Jumo 205 was prone to failure at full power. Another likely cause of rough running was how power was distributed. The propeller needed to be positioned higher on the engine to avoid visibility problems on single-engined aircraft and improved packaging and cowling design on multi-engined aircraft. This led to uneven power distribution between the upper and lower crankshafts. Most of the engine's accessories like fuel pumps, injectors and the supercharger were driven by the lower crankshaft, consuming a significant portion of the lower crankshaft's power. And the majority of the output to the propeller came from the upper crankshaft. This uneven power distribution likely contributed to the engine's rough operation. It's important to note that the Jumo 205 did not have a total loss oil system like typical two-stroke engines, as oil was recirculated. The engine featured a dry sump lubrication system, where pressurized oil was delivered to internal components and then returned to an external tank via scavenge pumps located at the bottom of the lower crankcase. This design had a limitation in that the engine couldn't be mounted in a flat orientation, such as inside a thick aircraft wing. In such a position, the oil scavenging system wouldn't function properly. One of the core design features of an opposed piston engine is that its pistons don't each have separate combustion events, as they do in a horizontally opposed engine. Instead, each pair of opposed pistons share a single combustion event. Besides eliminating the need for dedicated intake and exhaust components, does this design offer any specific advantages related to combustion? Yes, at least two significant ones. The first is improved thermal efficiency. Thermal efficiency measures how much of the energy in fuel is converted into mechanical power. More energy converted into heat is less energy converted into useful work. In an opposed piston engine, heat from combustion is absorbed by two pistons instead of one. This means less of that energy is converted into heat and more energy is converted into mechanical power, improving thermal efficiency. The second is reduced pulsations without losing power stroke overlap. Since one combustion event moves two pistons, the engine produces half as many pulsations per engine cycle as a normal engine of the same piston count. But the two-stroke cycle of the opposed piston engine increases the number of power strokes per cycle. Unlike a four-stroke engine, which completes a full cycle every 720 degrees of crankshaft rotation, a two-stroke engine completes a cycle in just 360 degrees, firing every time a piston reaches top dead center. With its 6 cylinders and a 360-degree cycle, the Jumo 205 had a 60-degree firing interval, the same as a V12 engine like the Jumo 210. The advantages of the opposed piston engine was clear. The Jumo 204 was also licensed built in the UK by Napier as the Culverin. But despite its advantages, the Jumo 205 never saw large-scale use during World War II. This was primarily due to poor throttle response and a tendency to fail under prolonged full-power operation. This stems from uneven combustion caused by the retarded crankshaft timing combined with a complex gearing system. It also failed to gain traction in non-combat roles after the war, but not due to flaws in its design. The rapid emergence of turbojet engines rendered piston engines obsolete for most high-power aviation applications. Almost no aircraft were powered by opposed piston engines after World War II. It did see some use on submarines, trucks, locomotives and tanks, but not on a massive scale. But in 2014, ATTRIBUTION published a technical paper on the opposed piston engine, citing a 30% fuel efficiency increase. And just like that, the opposed piston engine was back. In 2017, Volvo filed a patent for an opposed piston truck engine, and in 2021, Cummins was awarded an $87 million US Army contract to create a series of opposed piston engines for various applications. Back to Aero engines, let's take a look at one of the modern opposed piston engine designs, the Superior Air Parts Gemini engine. The Gemini 100 engine design is similar to the Jumo 205, so let's focus on where it differs. First, it's a 3-cylinder engine with 6 pistons, essentially 2 inline 3s joined at the head. Unlike inline 6 engines, inline 3s have an inherent rocking couple due to the outer pistons moving largely in opposite directions. To get an idea what this means, place an object in front of you and apply an upward force on one side and a downward force on the other, and then reverse the direction. Now imagine this happening about 40 times per second. This is a rocking couple and it creates vibration when an inline 3 engine is running. Now, joining 2 inline 3s by the head, you'll see the opposed pistons move in opposite directions. This cancels out the rocking couple imbalance on each inline 3, resulting in a smooth running engine. One unknown detail is whether the Gemini 100 engine offsets the intake crankshaft behind the exhaust crankshaft as in the Jumo 205. If so, it would slightly compromise balance, with the opposed pistons no longer perfectly countering each other's movement. But an offset in the region of 11 degrees on a small displacement, low torque engine, the vibrations would likely be well within acceptable limits, comparable to a Rotax 912 ULS Boxer 4, which it would directly compete with. It's also possible they don't trail one crank behind the other, but then scavenging efficiency would be reduced. Without more info, it's unclear which approach they took with the engine. Unlike the Jumo's centrifugal supercharger, the Gemini uses either a Roots type or twin screw supercharger. It's unclear whether it provides boost or is solely for scavenging, though the presence of a turbocharger on the slightly more powerful Gemini 125 suggests the latter. Another key difference is that the Gemini engine is mounted horizontally rather than upright. This makes it an easy retrofit on experimental aircraft designed for engines like the Continental 0200, Rotax 912 or other Boxer 4s. For propeller drive, it uses helical gears instead of spur gears with a reduction ratio of 1.6 to 1, meaning at the engine's maximum speed of 4000 rpm, the propeller spins at 2500 rpm. Price-wise, the Gemini 100 was expected to cost around $24,000, which I believe slightly undercuts the Rotax 912 ULS. It competes well on specs, being only slightly heavier, though its fuel consumption advantage over the 912 does look to be marginal. The Gemini engine can also be overhauled, unlike many diesel engines. That said, the Gemini project appears to have gone silent. If the project is still active, I'd love to hear from them. My email is in the channel's About page. But that's all I have to say. I hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.